Welcome everyone, and thanks for watching. Settlers of Kalguur has been great so far, and although my melee totem starter wasn't as strong as I'd hoped, I've cooked up something special for my second character of the league. Having finally pulled off an interaction that I've been sitting on for over a year, I'll be channeling my inner Jousis as I write off visual clarity, sound driver stability, and my own sanity in pursuit of my wardless lens loop bomber. I'll be showcasing the playstyle and some endgame encounters after explaining the build, so you can use the video chapters to skip ahead if that's what you're looking for. However, the real joy of this build is the journey to assemble the puzzle that it became. Those of you who enjoyed my crazy Hydrosphere build of the week are in for a treat this time around. We're headed for meme territory, so buckle up and let's get started with the mechanics. The cornerstone of the build is an interaction that I've been trying to make work for ages, and it starts with Malagaro's Lens. In exchange for -50 to all elemental resistances, we get a modest increase to life, AoE, attack speed, and our allies gain 1% of max life when we die. For the player, this might be the worst shield I've ever seen, but we can use Necromantic Aegis to grant it to our minions instead. Now, whenever our minions die, either from damage or expiring, we'll heal for 1% of their life, which tends to be a much bigger number. And we can use that healing to offset other on-death triggers, like Heartbound Loop. In addition to granting another chunk of both minion life and AoE, the ring will self-inflict 350 physical damage on minion death. If we can heal enough from the lens to offset the loop, then we could benefit from having taken damage while being net neutral on life. But it's important to know the order of operations if we're going to have a bunch of minions dying constantly. When a minion is dying, it resolves its own death effects before the player sees that it has died, so we'll heal from the lens before we take damage from the loop. This is good in that with enough healing, we could be at 1 life and still recover enough to take the hit without dying. But it does mean that we'll be left damaged at the end of the exchange. It's also important to know that even if several minions die simultaneously, their on-death effects will be resolved one by one. So if we have several skeletons expire together while we're near full life, the healing won't be wasted. The first will heal us and damage us, then the second will heal that loss and damage us again, and so on. There's one major limitation to this tech though, which is that tricky nearby term on Malagaro's Lens. By test, it appears to be 4 meters, and it's not affected by minion AoE, so we need to be quite close by if we want to avoid damage without healing. This will be relevant later, but assuming we can reliably out-heal the damage, we can use it to our advantage with cast when damage taken. If our minion's dying deals enough damage to reach the threshold, we can trigger the minion skill itself to resummon them, creating a spell loop. Summon Skeletons will be the minion of choice for several reasons. As the only repeatable skill that summons multiple minions, we'll get several instances of the lens loop interaction, which is needed to reach the damage threshold. And more importantly, we have a way to drastically reduce their duration with multiple 2 dust jewels. The faster the skeletons expire, the more frequently we can trigger our cast when damage taken setups. So we can combine 4 carefully rolled jewels with the window of opportunity wheel to reach 99% reduced duration, being careful to avoid minion or skill effect duration from any other source. This would take us from 20 seconds to 0.2, but the server only updates the game state 30 times per second, so it would round up to 0.231 seconds. We can drop to the frame before with the duration mastery, bringing us to 0.198 seconds total. However, we have cooldowns to contend with, as cast when damage taken puts a 0.25 second cooldown on anything it triggers. These cooldowns also align with server frames, so we'll need a minimum of 27% cooldown recovery rate to match the 0.198 duration. This can be done with a combination of influenced and crafted mods on our boots and belt. So we've got the timing sorted, up to 5 loops per second, but we need to ensure that we take enough damage to trigger it reliably. Cast when damage taken has a built-in trade-off between the damage threshold and the level of the gem that it can trigger. For both the damage of our main skill and the life of our skeletons, we need the gem to be as high level as possible, so we'll have to trigger a level 21 cast when damage taken. With 20 quality, that means 3,222 damage taken per loop, which is a lot to extract from the Heartbound Loop's 350 per minion. Traditional ward loop builds use the skeletons to trigger a level 1 Forbidden Rite, which deals the bulk of the damage in one big hit, but our per minion recovery wouldn't do anything to protect us from that. Instead, we'll run 2 Heartbound loops and use noxious catalysts to boost the physical damage taken. With the default 4 skeletons summoned, this would be 3,360 damage, allowing us to have a maximum of 4% mitigation against physical hits, but we can do better. Cast when damage taken restricts the level requirement of the triggered gem, but modifiers which increase gem level don't affect the level requirement. So with an arsenal of gem level effects, we can increase our skeletons to at least level 31, where we summon 5 at a time. With 5 guaranteed summons, we could take up to 4,200 unmitigated damage, allowing for up to 23% physical hit mitigation. But we'll especially need to avoid having any armor, which grants higher physical mitigation against small hits. It'll still be a weak point, but at least it's better than nothing, and we're going to need those gem levels for skeleton life anyways. Speaking of which, scaling enough skeleton life is what has held this build back for so long. With 5 skeletons, we'll be tuning our mitigation to take 645 damage per minion. So we need around 64,500 skeleton life to break even with the lens. We're going to need upwards of 600% increased minion life to achieve that, on top of several other scaling layers which we'll see later. Getting that much minion life will take a lot of investment, but it won't go to waste as we can use it to scale the damage of the main skill we'll be triggering with the loop. More minions are on the way, this time of the explosive variety. The natural way to scale damage from minion life is minion instability, which causes our minions to explode at half-life. We have several options to choose from, with Alcuna's Will zombies having the highest life, and animated weapons from Bladefall having a nice damage multiplier, but SRS of Enormity performs the best for several reasons. With a big life multiplier and guaranteed critical strikes from the explosions, which otherwise have 0% base crit, the damage potential for SRS is roughly double that of both zombies and anime weapon. We can use things like increased critical damage and other rare sources of minion crit multi for a substantial extra scaling layer. And maybe more importantly, as a short-lived temporary minion, SRS have a much better AI than other minions for this scenario, as they have almost no summoning animation, and they move aggressively into melee with nearby enemies rather than following the player. There's a couple complicating factors though, the first of which is SRS of Enormity's fairly small minion limit at 6. We'll be summoning 5 per second, so there's a very short window to get them to half-life. Tavukai is a tempting option, but the Chaos degen won't be enough, as we need our SRS to lose over 42% of their life per second, in addition to overcoming any regen and the healing they'll receive from other SRS and skeletons dying with Malgaro's lens. In order to burn them quickly enough, we'll have to use Infernal Legion, which starts at 40% of life per second, but synergizes nicely with the significant resistance penalty from the lens. The SRS will balance out to negative 10% fire resistance, assuming we're careful not to get any other source of minion resistance, but we need more to overcome the incidental lens healing. We can make use of the intended downside of Fortress Covenant to replace a couple unnecessary notables on the tree and increase the burn to over 61% per second, which is enough to get them popping. It's worth noting that most loot builds will use the Blessed Rebirth cluster notable to protect their skeletons from being killed before their cooldown is finished, but this would prevent us from reaching low life in time, and our skeletons are very durable, with over 23,000 life to burn through in their 0.2 second lifespan. The second complication for SRS is that, in seeking out nearby enemies, they will often leave the 4-meter range for our lens healing. With over 2.5 times the life of our skeletons, SRS dying near us will likely heal us to full, but many will give us nothing. We can offset this somewhat by overshooting our minimum skeleton life so that regular operation heals us, but it can be overshadowed with the use of recoup. Since we're taking nearly 20,000 pre-mitigated damage per second, the recovery we'll get from 45% life recoup and 20% mana recoup between the tree and gear will be plenty to cover our missed SRS heals, sustain our crazy mana costs, and outpace any damage that doesn't one-shot us. However, SRS chasing enemies actually isn't the worst loss of healing we can experience. If at any point our character teleports 4 meters away from our skeletons, we'll take all of their damage without healing. We'll take at least the 645 damage from 5 skeletons and 1 SRS, but we'll also likely miss healing from all of the other remaining SRS over the next second, without much room to buffer the damage. This means that, in order to flame dash, we need a minimum of 4,000 life, preferably reaching up past 4,500, and we'll need to be careful about flame dashing into or out of dangerous situations. Thankfully though, Most area transitions either have a grace period or place us far enough away from our original position that minion AI is disabled before the skeletons would expire, so we'll take no damage and can simply restart the loop. With all that though, the build should be functional, but we've got a lot of requirements, and we need damage and defensive scaling on top of that, so let's see how to pull it all together. Let's begin with the skeletons, which will scale from level 21 all the way up to 33 thanks to global increases from the weapon, helmet, and amulet, as well as local increases from a level 4 in power and double corruption on the gloves. Any combination of +2 minion, +2 duration, or +1 to all will do. Both minion life support and the necromancer's mindless aggression are multiplicative modifiers, after which we just need 600% increased minion life. Small quantities can be had in our gear from the Heartbound loops, Malagaro's lens, and an Eldritch implicit, but the bulk will come from a powerful timeless jewel on the tree. We can take a few minion life nodes on the base tree, along with a couple of cluster jewels, but the real standout is a carefully chosen elegant hubris jewel. The first thing it does is convert conveniently placed notables into substantial 80% life nodes, and the second is to grant supreme ostentation, which removes all attribute requirements and allows us to tattoo the whole tree, with bonuses to resists, movement speed or spell suppression, and, most importantly, a total of 100% minion life. With all this, our skeletons end up with over 75,000 life, just enough to come out positive from the loop. To enable the loop itself, I've scaled my Heartbound loots up to a total of 735 damage per minion, which I mitigate down to 647 thanks to the reduced damage taken from 3 endurance charges. I can keep the charges up indefinitely with an anoint for inexorable, which grants them 25% of the time when hit. Since I've opted for endurance charges over physical damage reduction, I need to avoid it from all of their sources, including armor bases, pantheons like Lunaris and Solaris, and even my own ascendancy. In fact, I only end up taking 3 necromancer notables, as unnatural strength would have no effect on minion instability, Essence Glutton could grant minions regen, Commander of Darkness would grant minions fire resistance, Mistress of Sacrifice would grant minion duration, and Bone Barrier would grant inconsistent PDR. Instead, I take some small nodes for minion damage and life, Plaguebringer, and Corpse Pact, which we'll see in a minute. Since we can't have any armor, our physical mitigation is low, and our energy shield will be constantly burned away, our best bet for survivability is to scale evasion. With no attribute requirements, thanks to Supreme Ostentation, we can run evasion bases as well as grace, linked to Eternal Blessing to keep our mana available for the loop. With all those bases, we can additionally scale a bit of spell suppression, with a mastery on the tree, dex tattoos, and a quartz flask, whose phasing will be important for mapping. We can amplify our chance to evade by blinding enemies with the Dark Seer, which has a few other important properties. Up to 200 flat life and mana are hugely impactful in reaching our minimum threshold to Flame Dash and giving us enough mana to comfortably start the loop, while Malediction is one of the few sources that reduce enemy damage dealt to us, without affecting the damage we deal to ourselves. The other source that we have is Plaguebringer, which reduces enemy damage dealt while a corpse is nearby. Those corpses also boost our SOS damage both directly and by shocking enemies. If we consume the corpses, we can also boost minion instability's AoE and gain a ton of cast speed, which will be nice for some support spells. In order to get both benefits, we need to have consumed corpses while still having corpses around. We'll trigger Desecrate to spawn 5 corpses, and Volatile Dead to consume only 3 of them. Volatile Dead can hit enemies up to 6 times per cast, so that'll easily proc the 10% chance to blind, and can ignite to apply the debuff from combustion. To round out the defenses, it's very important to get shock immunity for the build, as any increases to our damage taken could be disastrous. We can achieve immunity through mods on an Abyss Jewel and our boots, requiring the same Crusader influence as the cooldown modifier. And, of course, we can convert that 100% chance to avoid shock into full ailment immunity with Storm Shroud. On the offensive side, we have a few more tools, the first of which is an Animate Guardian. You might think it'd be hard to keep alive with how hard we are trying to kill our SRS quickly, but we can use Elemental Army and a couple gear pieces with good stats to get the AG to 80 Elemental Res. Less damage taken from both Meat Shield and a Doppelganger guys go a long way, and that 10% life regen is massive with over 170,000 life. To help the AG apply both the exposure from Elemental Army and the buff from Feeding Frenzy, The tempestuous steel will grant the necessary fire damage and guarantee hits. And even without hitting, we get 2 powerful auras from Legacy of Fury, which scorches enemies, and an influenced helmet, which affects enemy res and damage taken. It might seem like a Kingmaker would be perfect for the AG, with crit multi, culling strike, and rarity, but the 10 fortification affects our damage taken, and is quite inconsistent because of the small aura radius. But to round things out, we can use a few manual buffs when the situation calls for it, with crit multi from Spirit Offering and resist reduction with elemental weakness and flammability from a ring corruption. So with all that said and done, let's figure out how to play this thing. With all the pieces assembled, we still need to get the loop started somehow. Wardloop builds would swap to an essence crafted wand for spectral raging spirits, but they won't have enough life to offset their damage, and we need 5 minions to die for our loop to begin. Instead, we use a corrupted Invictus Solaris to boost a manual summon skeletons beyond level 31. When swapping back, the skeletons will be affected by Malagar's lens before dying, so we'll heal from them like normal. There is one issue though. Our skeletons only last 0.2 seconds, which is not enough time to swap before they expire, starting the loop without the lens. This can be mitigated by additionally equipping a wand with the Temple mod for increased minion duration. Since it's additive with our 99% reduced duration, this gives us over 3 seconds to swap back. Once we do, the loop will start, but we don't have any accumulated mana recoup yet. Depending on how big your mana pool is, you may fail to start the loop, but will then have some mana recouping, so a second attempt will start it. With a larger pool, you may run out of mana, but produce enough SRS that die over the next second to restart the loop themselves. And with a sufficiently sized pool, the loop can sustain itself before running out. Since our intelligence is not scaling mana, the 200 flat from the Darkseer makes a big difference here, as the difference between 1 swap or 2 is a big deal when re-entering a boss fight. Whenever you transition between areas within a zone though, a single swap is always enough, because your recoup will still be running. Another thing that can improve the startup is reduced mana cost, which I grab a bit of on a life wheel thanks to this timeless jewel placement. So, let's put it all together. Skeletons drive the loop, and SRS deal the damage, trailing behind and chasing enemies. Desecrate provides corpse auras, and fuels Volatile Dead, which ensures that we can't see anything. While it's not strictly necessary, I consider the Void MTX to be a big step up for visual clarity, letting us see more enemy effects and revealing the SRS, which turn purple with our offering. You can play without it if you must, or even switch to Blazing Salvo and use a recovery mastery to consume corpses. But with everything ready to go, we can see how it performs. In actual gameplay, all we do is start up the loop and run through the map. In most content, it's safe to run headfirst through packs, but in more dangerous content, you can run around packs to dodge their attacks and allow your SRS to make their own way through. Whenever you encounter a tough rare or boss, the 2 curses can be cast almost instantly with all the cast speed from Corpse Pact, and you can cast your offering if you really need to max out your DPS. In terms of rare modifiers that endanger the build, both Temporal Bubble and Mana Siphoner rares are capable of turning the loop off by restricting our cooldowns or mana pool. If you end up stepping into either effect, you can just dash away and weapon swap to start back up. Most map modifiers have surprisingly little effect on the build as well, with only less cooldown rate being impossible and less recovery rate and vulnerability being slightly more dangerous. Even things like no regen are no concern, as our recovery is almost entirely recoup. Even though the physical defense is quite poor, I found that the ability to stay moving is huge for survivability. Standing still exposes you to all sorts of delayed effects and prevents you from sidestepping projectiles. Especially in encounters like Ritual or Ultimatum, moving is what keeps you alive, and has gotten me to level 96 so far. For bossing, our weakness to one-shots is more evident, but I was still able to complete all of the endgame encounters, up to and including the Feared. There's something very satisfying about trivializing certain fast-hitting or damage over time effects, like Shaper Beams, Awakener Storms, and the Admiral's Wave Walls. Even more satisfying, though, has been the process of pulling this puzzle of a build off. Like I said, the idea has been knocking around my head for over a year, but it's always seemed barely feasible. That remains true, as the build can only function once fully assembled and leveled, but it's been fun to fine-tune nonetheless. I've seen lots of you call for more content, but these videos take a lot of effort, so they come whenever motivation strikes. Despite that, I hope you enjoyed this second video for the league. If you thought this showcase was cool, share it with a friend who might like it too. I'll be happy to hear from you in the comments, or on the Discord server, which is linked in the description. But until then, have a good one.